It is still dark. The city of Jerusalem is asleep. The Sabbath ended at sundown last night, and now it is the first day of the week, and the sky is the color it turns just before it decides to become morning. Somewhere in that city, 11 men who had followed Jesus for 3 years are behind locked doors, afraid. She is not behind locked doors. She is walking toward a tomb. Her name is Mary. She is from a town called Magdala, a fishing settlement on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee, known for its salt-cured fish and its busy market. She is not a beggar. She is not a prostitute. We know from the Gospel of Luke that she is a woman of enough means to fund the traveling ministry of Jesus out of her own resources. She is also a woman who had experienced something most of us will never experience, a severe, prolonged spiritual torment that the text describes as 7 demons. And then she met Jesus. And that was the end of the torment. And she never left his side after that. She was at the cross on Friday when the 12 were gone. She watched them bury him on Friday evening and noted exactly where the tomb was. And now it is Sunday morning before dawn, and she is walking back. This is not a story about a saint with a halo and a painting. This is not a story about a repentant prostitute. That story was invented by a pope in AD 591, and it is not in the Bible. This is not a story the church got right for 1400 years. This is a story about what happens when God looks out at a broken, grieving world on the most important morning in history and chooses the most overlooked person in the room to carry the news. Stay with me, because before this story is over, Jesus is going to say one word. Just one word. And I want you to pay attention when we get there, because the entire story lives inside that single word. Here in Apos, that's what most people miss. We know Mary Magdalene and Apos, name. We know where she was from. We know her story before and after she met Jesus. We know that she was present at the cross, at the burial, and at the empty tomb, that she witnessed all 3 of the most significant events in Christian history. All 4 gospel writers include her. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. 4 accounts, for writers, for different perspectives. And all 4 of them agree, Mary Magdalene was there. Think about that for a moment. In a culture where women and Apos' testimony was legally worthless, where a woman could not testify in a Jewish court under any circumstances, 4 separate authors chose a woman as their primary witness of the resurrection. Nobody inventing a resurrection story in the 1st century would have done that. If you wanted people to believe you, you would have chosen Peter. You would have chosen one of the 12. You would have chosen someone whose word would hold up in court. Instead, every gospel writer names a woman from Galilee as the first eyewitness. That is not a detail anyone would have made up. That is a detail that survived because it was true. She walked toward the tomb in the dark. She didn't Apos know what she was walking into. She only knew she was Apos ready to leave. And that, the staying when everyone else had already gone, is the first thing you need to understand about her. Let Apos go back to the beginning of her story, because what happened Sunday morning only makes sense if you understand what came before it. Luke chapter 8 tells us something most Bible teachers skim past in 2 sentences. It says that as Jesus traveled from town to town, certain women traveled with him and the 12 disciples. It names them: Mary Magdalene, Joanna, wife of Herod and Apos' household manager, Susanna, and others. And then the text says something remarkable. These women were supporting the ministry out of their own means. Their own means. She was not following at a distance and occasionally bringing bread. She was funding the operation. In a culture that did not extend full property rights to women in most circumstances, she had resources, and she used them for this. She was a patron of the ministry of Jesus, the way wealthy men in Rome supported philosophers and teachers. This was her deliberate, committed investment. The same passage mentions, almost in passing, that she had been healed of 7 demons. 7. The text doesn't Apos dramatize it. It doesn't Apos explain it. It just names it as part of her history. But if you have any sense of what that phrase would have meant in the 1st century, the kind of suffering, the kind of interior darkness, the kind of loss of self it would have looked like from the outside, then you understand that by the time she met Jesus, she had already been through something that would have finished most people. She had been through the kind of suffering that makes you wonder if you will ever be whole again. And she came out the other side. And she followed him. This matters. Because what comes next is not a story about a woman who had an easy life and made a convenient choice. It is a story about a woman who had been through real darkness and chose, every single time, to walk toward the light. Now we come to Friday. The arrest happened Thursday night in the Garden of Gethsemane. The disciples were there. Peter tried to fight back and cut off a soldier and Apos' ear. And then, when the soldiers bound Jesus and led him away, every one of the 12 ran. Mark chapter 14 tells us this plainly. They all left him and fled. One of them ran so fast he left his clothes behind. She didn't and Apos' run. We don't and Apos' know exactly where she was during the trials. What we know is where she was at the crucifixion. Mark chapter 15, verse 40. There were also women watching from a distance, including Mary Magdalene. John chapter 19 goes further. He places her not watching from a distance, but standing at the cross. Standing next to Jesus and Apos' mother, close enough to hear him speak. The 12 were gone. She was there. She watched him die. She followed the burial party to the tomb and noted exactly where it was. She sat across from the sealed entrance as the stone was rolled in front of it. And then she went home. But it gets stranger. The morning after the Sabbath, before the sun was up, she came back. And when she arrived, the stone was already moved. Now here is where you need to understand something about the world she lived in. The Greek word for witness is martyria. You recognize the root. It is where we eventually get the word martyr. To be a witness in the ancient world was not a minor thing. It was a legal act. Your testimony could determine whether someone lived or died. In first-century Jewish law, documented not only in the Bible but in the writings of Josephus, the Jewish historian who wrote within decades of these events, a woman and Apos' testimony was inadmissible in court. Josephus wrote it directly. Let not the testimony of women be admitted, on account of the levity and boldness of their sex. Not a fringe opinion. The official judicial standard of the world Mary Magdalene lived in. And into that world, Jesus looked at her and said, Go and tell. Go and tell. He commissioned her to give testimony. Legal testimony. The most significant testimony any human being had ever been asked to give, that the man they had watched die 3 days earlier was standing in front of her, alive. Go and tell. She knew exactly what the disciples would think when she got there. She went anyway. Now let and Apos' go to the garden. John chapter 20. Mary arrives at the tomb in the early morning and the stone is moved. She runs to find Peter and John. She tells them, the body is gone and we don't and Apos' know where they put him. Peter and John run to the tomb. They go inside. They see the burial cloths folded neatly on the stone slab. They see and they believe. Though the next line tells us they still didn't and Apos' understand what the scripture had said about rising from the dead. And then Peter and John went home. She didn't and Apos' go home. Pay attention to this. In one of the most dramatic mornings in human history, a sealed tomb standing open, the body of Jesus nowhere to be found. 2 disciples who had just run to check for themselves. Mary Magdalene stayed. She stood outside the tomb and she wept. The Greek word John uses is kleo, not delicate, dignified weeping. This is the cry of grief, the kind that bends you forward, the kind that comes out when you have already lost someone and now you cannot even find where they put him. She bent down and looked inside the tomb. She saw 2 angels sitting where the body had been, one at the head, one at the feet. They asked her why she was weeping. She said, Because they have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have put him. Notice what she did not do. She did not say, You are angels, tell me what happened. She did not stop weeping. She had come to finish the burial preparations she hadn't and Apos' been able to complete on Friday. She had a purpose. She was going to find him. Even if finding him meant finding a body. Even if there was nothing left to do but be there. She turned around. And this is where it gets remarkable. There was a man standing in the garden. She didn't and Apos' recognize him. She thought he was the gardener. He asked her the same question the angels had asked. Why are you weeping? Who are you looking for? She said, Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you put him, and I will take him. Take him. She would carry a body. She didn't and Apos' have a plan for where or how. She was just not leaving without him. And then the man said one word. He said Mary. The Greek text of John chapter 20 records it as Miriam, her Aramaic name, the name she had been called since childhood, spoken the way only someone who truly knew her would say it. Not woman, not friend, not a title or a greeting. Her name, her actual name, In the voice she recognized before her mind had caught up with what was happening. She turned. She said, "Rabboni, teacher, this is the one word I told you about at the beginning. I told you that Jesus was going to say one word, and that the entire story lived inside it. Here it is. Not a sermon, not a theological statement, not a command, a name, her name." On the morning of the resurrection, with all of history balanced on what came next, the first thing the risen Jesus chose to say to a human being was a woman and Apos' name. The early church father Hippolytus, writing in the 3rd century, gave Mary Magdalene the title Apostola Apostolorum, the apostle to the apostles. The Greek word apostolos means one who is sent. It is the same word used for Peter, for Paul, for the 12. She was sent first, with the first message, to the first audience. God did not appear first to Peter, the leader. God did not appear first to John, the beloved disciple. God did not appear first to his own mother. He appeared to a woman from Galilee who had come through spiritual devastation and public stigma, and the particular grief of watching someone you love die while you could do nothing, and who was, on the morning of the resurrection, the only one still standing at the tomb. 3,000 years separate you from that garden. The feeling of being overlooked doesn't end Apos. She ran. She ran back to where the disciples were gathered. She had seen the risen Jesus. She had spoken to him. She had been commissioned with words that were, in the context of that morning, the most important message any human being had ever been asked to carry. She told them everything. Luke chapter 24, verse 11. And these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe the women. Idle tale. The Greek word is luros. It was a medical term. It referred to the babbling of a fever patient. The disciples, hearing the most important news in human history from the woman who had just witnessed it firsthand, dismissed it as the raving of someone who wasn't Apos, thinking clearly. She had known this was coming. Here is what I need you to hear, because this is the part one believes speaks to something many of you carry. There are women in every generation who saw something clearly, who told the truth about what they witnessed, who went to the people who were supposed to believe them, and were told they were imagining it. The woman who reported what happened to her and was told she was mistaken. The employee who raised the alarm and was managed out of the room. The daughter who named what she saw and was asked to keep the peace. The doctor who looked at the numbers and was overruled by someone with more authority. Mary Magdalene is not a metaphor. She was a real woman who experienced this in its literal form. She told the truth about a world-changing event. She was an eyewitness. She was dismissed. And she was right. Here in Apos, that's the part nobody tells you. Within 48 hours, Peter would experience the risen Jesus himself. Within days, more than 500 people would see him, according to Paul and Apos' account in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. The disciples who called her account a fever dream would become the people who died proclaiming the same message she brought them that morning. She was first. She was right. And she was believed, just not yet. The news she carried did not depend on whether the disciples accepted it in that room. The truth she had witnessed did not shrink because the people closest to her couldn't and Apos receive it yet. She had been given something real. She had been commissioned by someone who knew exactly what would happen when she walked into that room. He sent her anyway, not because they would believe her today, because the truth she carried was going to outlast all of them. Before I give you the 3 things I want you to take from this, I want to ask you something. What is the one detail about Mary Magdalene that surprised you most in this video? Tell me in the comments. I read them. Here are the 3 things. First, the fact that all 4 gospel writers chose a woman. This woman specifically, as the primary witness of the resurrection, is one of the strongest arguments for the historical reliability of the accounts. If you were constructing a story in 1st century Judea that you wanted people to believe, you would never have chosen a female witness. No one inventing this would have made that choice. Her presence in the text is not decoration. It is evidence. Second, your past does not determine your assignment. Mary Magdalene had been through a spiritual darkness that the text takes 1/2 of a sentence to describe and a lifetime to understand. She had a history people used to summarize her. She carried a reputation that followed her out of Magdala. And on the morning that mattered most, God walked past Peter, walked past John, walked past everyone who would have been the more credible choice by the world and Apos as standards, and said, "You go first. Whatever they have said about you, whatever you have been through, Whatever is in your history that you think makes you the wrong choice. Pay attention to who God chose on the most important morning in history. Third, when the world had dismissed her, when the disciples had gone home, when she was alone and weeping at a tomb she had no good reason to believe would give her anything back, Jesus did not send a message. He did not send an angel with an explanation. He came himself. He stood in the garden in the early morning, and when he saw her, he did not say, "Be not afraid," or "I am risen," or "Go and sin no more." He said her name, just her name. If you have ever stood somewhere alone and wondered whether you were seen, this is the answer. She was the first, and she was believed, just not yet.